The Iron Veil Range had vanished. It wasn't hidden by shadow or dusk. It was annihilated by the sky itself. Late February, 1881. The Montana Territory was in the grip of a white death, a blizzard that didn't just howl. It shrieked a high, thin sound that cut through fleece, through leather, and settled deep in the bone. The snow didn't fall. It attacked, driven horizontally by a wind that had crossed 1,000 miles of frozen prairie with nothing to stop it. Rowan Hargrove felt it as a personal assault. He leaned low over the neck of his mount, a short-coupled Mustang named Boulder, burying his face in the horse's ice-encrusted mane. His own beard was a solid plate of ice. His hat was pulled so low it nearly blinded him, but there was nothing to see. Only white. A churning, blinding, suffocating world reduced to the next agonizing breath and the sturdy warmth of the animal beneath him. He was checking his trap lines near Fallow Bend, a fool's errand in a storm that had dropped the temperature to 30 below zero. But starvation was a worse fool. The wind hit him like a physical blow, a flat-handed slam against his back that made Boulder grunt and shift. He was a recluse, a man who had intentionally sought the silence of this high and lonely valley. Today, the silence was deafening. He stopped. Boulder protested, shaking his head, wanting the shelter of the pines they'd left a mile back. "Hush!" Rowan breathed. The word was stolen, ripped from his lips by the gale. He'd stopped because his instincts, honed by a decade of solitude, screamed at him. He turned his head, letting the ice pellets sting his ear. And he heard it. It couldn't be real. The wind in the Iron Veils played tricks. It mimicked wolves, mountain cats, and dying men. He had heard them all. But this was different. It was thin, impossibly thin, a needle of sound in the wall of noise. It was high-pitched, desperate. It wasn't an animal. It was a baby. His gut clenched. It was impossible. No human, much less an infant, could survive this for more than an hour. It had to be a cat. It had to be. It came again, a weak, wavering cry, almost lost, but undeniably human. Rowan didn't hesitate. He turned the Boulder toward the sound, urging him off the faint trail and into the deeper drifts. Blue Wind Creek was somewhere to his left, a frozen scar in the landscape, its banks choked with willow and rock. The sound was coming from there. He dismounted, sinking to his hip in a drift of powdery snow. The cold was instant, brutal, sucking the heat from his legs. He pulled his torch, a thick branch wrapped in oil-soaked rags, from his saddle. He shielded his tinderbox with his body, his fingers clumsy inside their thick leather mittens. He ripped one off with his teeth, his bare hand, red and raw in seconds, struck the flint against the steel. A spark! Another, a third caught the tinder. He blew on it, a plume of his own breath freezing as it hit the air, and the Tito-oiled rag caught with a sputtering whoosh. He held the torch high. The wind immediately attacked the flame, making it dance wildly, threatening to snuff it out. The light cast terrifying, moving shadows on the curtain of snow. He pushed forward, shielding the flame with his arm, following the sound that was now weaker, just a faint mewling. He found the cleft, a shallow overhang in the creek bank, barely more than a hollow in the rock, shielded from the worst of the wind by a fallen cottonwood. Ice coated the entrance like thick, bubbled glass. He smashed the ice with his boot heel and shoved the torch inside. In the weak, flickering light, he saw her. She wasn't a woman. She was a drift of snow and rags, slumped against the frozen rock. Lydia Merritt, though he wouldn't know her name for hours, was barely conscious. Her eyes were open but saw nothing, the pupils dilated wide, fixed on a place beyond the storm. Her hair was matted with ice. Her lips were a pale, deathly blue. And in her arms, clutched to her chest with a desperate, frozen strength, were two bundles wrapped in what looked like stiff, coarse burlap. One of the infants let out the weak cry that had summoned him. The other was terrifyingly silent. He pushed into the narrow space, The torch illuminated the horror. Her wrists, they were raw, dark, angry circles where harsh rope had bitten deep into the flesh. Not just tied, but bound with a cruelty that spoke of malice. The skin was broken, frozen blood forming a black crust. He saw the shadow of other marks on her arms, dark lines beneath the frost that suggested a desperate, violent escape. She was clutching the bundle so tightly her knuckles were white and bloodless. She hadn't given up. She had just run out of strength. As if summoned by the devil. A gust tore down the creek bed, funneling into the cleft. The torch flared once, twice, and died. Plunged into darkness. The only sound was the wind's roar and the sudden, sharp intake of his own breath. The crying, already weak, stopped, choked off by the sudden, absolute cold. Rowan didn't curse. He moved. His actions were swift, economical, brutal in their efficiency. He shoved his body into the opening, turning his massive, sheepskin-coated back to the wind, creating a small pocket of stillness. His gloves were stiff, useless. He tore them both off and threw them. His bare hands fumbled for his tinderbox again. Flint on steel, spark, spark. The cold was searing his skin. He couldn't feel his fingers. A tiny flame caught the tinder. He cupped it, breathing life into it, shielding it with his chest. He didn't relight the torch. There was no time. He lit a sulfur match from the tinder, its acrid smell sharp in the frozen air. In the brief, sputtering glare, he saw the rope still looped on one wrist. It looked like abrasive baling twine, stiff with ice. He pulled his knife from its sheath. The blade was a dull gray in the matchlight. "Hold still," he growled. He didn't know if she heard him. He slid the blade between the fibers and her raw skin. He didn't cut towards her. He sawed away, his thumb pushing the twine against the blade, his other hand shielding her flesh. The twine snapped. She flinched, a low, animal moan escaping her blue lips, but she didn't or couldn't pull away. The match died. He was in darkness again. "We're leaving," he said. His voice was rust. He grabbed her. He hooked one arm under her knees, the other under her back. She weighed nothing, a bundle of sticks and wet rags. He lifted her. "The children," she whispered. Her voice was cracked ice, the words barely audible. He couldn't carry all three, not through the drifts. He set her down for a second, propping her against the rock. He unbuttoned his heavy sheepskin coat. The warmth from his own chest steamed in the frigid air. "Give them to me." Her arms wouldn't unclench. They were frozen in place. He had to physically pry her fingers open. He took the first bundle. It was small, terribly cold. He didn't look at it. He couldn't. He tucked it against his woolen undershirt, directly against his skin. Then the second one. He buttoned the coat over them, creating a warm, dark hammock of fleece and body heat against his ribs. He lifted Lydia again. He half dragged, half carried her out of the cleft and back to the horse. Getting her onto Boulder's back was the next fight. She was limp, a dead weight. He shoved her up, slinging her sideways across the saddle like a sack of flour. Boulder shied, unhappy with the scent of blood and the dead weight. "Easy," Rowan hissed, grabbing the bridle. He mounted behind her, pulling her upright, seating her in front of him. He wrapped his arms around her, one hand gripping the saddle horn, the other holding her secure against his chest. He was now shielding her, his body taking the full force of the wind, while the two infants were shielded by his coat. "Hup," he commanded. Boulder grunted, his muscles straining, and began the climb. The slope up from Blue Wind Creek was steep, slick with ice hidden beneath the powder. Rowan didn't ask a single question. He didn't ask her name, where she came from, or who had done this to her. Questions were a luxury. They were noise. Noise was wasted breath. Breath was heat. He needed every ounce of heat he had. Boulder slipped, his front legs going to their knees. Rowan threw his weight back, hauling on the reins, keeping them balanced. The horse scrambled, found his footing, and pushed on. Rowan could feel the woman's shivers, a violent, uncontrollable trembling that passed through his own clothes. He tried to project his own warmth into her, a futile gesture, but it was all he could do. Inside his coat, against his chest, he felt a tiny, faint stirring, a single, reflexive kick from a tiny foot. Live, just live until the fire. It felt like a lifetime. The mile back to his cabin was a journey through a frozen hell. But at last, the dark shape of Cedar Hollow loomed out of the white. It wasn't much. A one-room cabin built into the side of a hill, its roof covered in sod. But its walls were 3 feet thick, and it was the only sanctuary in 50 miles. He slid from the saddle, his legs numb. He pulled Lydia down, her body collapsing into his. He kicked the heavy plank door open and carried her inside. The cabin was frigid. The air was dead and cold. The hearth was a pit of gray, lifeless ash. He laid Lydia on his cot, the only furniture save for a table and 2 stools. He covered her with his bedroll. He didn't waste time on small kindling. He strode to the center of the room, reached up to the low rafters, and pulled down a bundle of dry, resinous pine knots he kept tied there for emergencies. This was an emergency. He knelt at the hearth. He didn't bother with the tinderbox. He pulled another sulfur match from his vest, struck it on the rough stone of the fireplace, and touched it to the pine. The wood exploded in a whoosh of bright, hot flame. The resin snapped and popped. He piled larger logs on, dry aspen and pine. A fierce, wonderful heat began to radiate into the room, fighting back against the killing cold. Only then did he turn his attention to the infants. He carefully unbuttoned his coat. He laid the 2 small bundles on the rough-hewn table, close to the fire, but not too close, gently. He unwrapped the stiff, frozen burlap. They were tiny, a matched pair, girls. Their skin was a mottled blue-gray color, their limbs still, but they were breathing, shallow, infrequent breaths. He grabbed a spare flannel shirt from a peg, tore it into strips with his bare hands, and gently wiped the ice and frost from their faces. He kept a single nanny goat in the lean-to attached to the cabin. He pushed his way out, the wind slamming the door shut behind him. He returned a minute later, a small tin pail in his hand. The morning's milk was thick with ice crystals, but not yet frozen solid. He poured some into a small pot, holding it over the new fire. He let it get warm, testing it with a drop on his own raw wrist. He didn't have a bottle. He took his smallest wooden spoon, one he'd carved himself from birch. He dipped it in the warm milk, catching just a few drops. He went to the first baby, the one who had cried. He touched the edge of the spoon to her blue lips. She didn't respond. "Come on," he growled, the sound unnaturally loud in the cabin. "Drink." He touched the milk to her lip again. A tiny, reflexive suck, a movement of her throat. She swallowed. His hands, they were huge, calloused, scarred from logging, trapping, and a life of hard labor. They could break a man's jaw or set a fence post, but now, holding that tiny spoon, they trembled, just slightly. He dipped the spoon again. He fed her, drop by drop, until her color began to change from gray to a pale, mottled pink. He moved to the second child. She was weaker, but she, too, drank. The heat was working. On the cot, Lydia stirred. A low moan rattled in her chest. Her eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, found the fire. Then they darted to the table, where Rowan stood over the infants. A raw, terrible sound came from her throat. She tried to sit up, her body too weak, and fell back against the cot. "No," she whispered. The word was a gasp of pure terror. "No, please, don't let them take my children. He'll... She couldn't finish. Her gaze was frantic, locked on the flames as if seeing something monstrous rising from them. Rowan stopped. He looked at her, at the terror in her eyes. He took one of the babies, now wrapped in a clean, soft piece of his own flannel, and carried it to the cot. He placed it in the crook of Lydia's arm. He went back, got the second one, and placed it beside her. He stood back, his massive frame filling the small cabin. He looked from the heavy, barred door, to the roaring fire, to the woman and her children on his cot. He let the silence, the safety, fill the room, pushing out the storm. Lydia's eyes met his. They were still full of terror, but now a desperate question. 2. Rowan Hargrove gave her the only truth he had, the only thing that mattered. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the sound of the wind. "You are safe here." The storm's shriek had passed. It was replaced by a deep, resonant groan. The sound of 1,000,000 tons of snow settling on the roof. The sound of wind searching for a purchase it could no longer find. The world outside was still a chaos of white, but the cabin at Cedar Hollow had become an island of stillness. The only sound inside, the only rhythm, was the steady, metronomic crackle of the resin-rich pine in the hearth. It wasn't a fire, it was a living, breathing thing, a second heart beating in the room, radiating a dry, penetrating warmth that pushed back the deathly cold. Rowan moved with a deliberateness that was almost silent. He took a kettle from a hook over the fire, its bottom blackened with soot. He broke the ice in the water bucket with his fist and filled the kettle, setting it on the grate to warm. Then he went to a small, dove-tailed box on the shelf. It held his supplies. He took out a small, dark bottle of grain alcohol kept for snake bites and cleaning wounds and a roll of what looked like clean, torn strips of linen. Lydia was conscious, but barely. She lay on the cot, the 2 flannel-wrapped bundles nestled beside her, her eyes tracking his movements with a dazed, animal fear. He didn't speak. He brought the stool to the side of the cot and sat. He took a clean rag, dipped it in the now steaming water from the kettle, and wrung it out. "This might hurt," he said. It wasn't a request for permission. He gently, so gently, touched the warm, wet cloth to her left wrist. The burlap and twine had been soaked in melted snow and blood, and had frozen solid to her skin. She gasped, a sharp, ragged intake of breath, as the first touch of heat met the raw nerves. Rowan didn't pause. He worked with a surgeon's focus. He held the cloth there, letting the warmth soak in, softening the fibers. He worked particle by particle, peeling back the stiff, abrasive twine that had been looped and tightened, its pattern a cruel tattoo on her flesh. The skin beneath was a mess of purple bruising and deep, weeping abrasions. Where the twine had knotted, it had rubbed the skin away entirely, leaving raw, red circles. Lydia's eyes were screwed shut. Her free hand gripped the edge of the cot, her knuckles white. She didn't make another sound. He finally got the last of the frozen rags and bindings off both wrists. He tossed the soiled remnants into the fire, where they sizzled and flared, consumed in an instant. He unstopped the dark bottle. The sharp, clean scent of the alcohol cut through the smell of pine smoke. He poured a small amount onto a fresh strip of linen. He looked at her. Her eyes were open again, wide, anticipating the sting. "Breathe in," he commanded. She did, and as she exhaled, he pressed the alcohol-soaked cloth to the worst of the wounds. It was a sharp, white-hot fire. Lydia's whole body went rigid. A silent scream locked in her throat. A single tear escaped her closed eyelid and tracked, hot, down her temple. Rowan's hand was like iron, holding her arm steady. He didn't scrub. He pressed, cleaned, and lifted. Then, before the air could hit the wound and make it sting worse, he leaned in and blew on it. It was a simple, practical gesture, a steady, gentle stream of his own warm breath, cooling the alcohol, taking the sharpest edge off the pain. Lydia's hand uncurled from the cot. She stared at him, her expression lost between shock and confusion. This man, who looked as rough as the mountains he lived in, who had the strength to carry her through a blizzard, was tending to her with a gentleness she hadn't known existed. He did the same to the other wrist, the same precise, painful cleansing, the same quiet, steady breath to cool the sting. He didn't coddle her. He didn't offer words of comfort. He just did the work. He finished by wrapping both wrists in the clean linen strips. The bandaging was firm, practical, the knots flat and secure. He stood. He moved to the iron nail driven into the log wall near the door. He unslung his massive, dripping sheepskin coat. The weight of it was immense, laden with at least 10 pounds of ice and water. He hung it, and the floorboards beneath it immediately darkened as a puddle began to form. The smell of wet wool and the faint, clean scent of horse filled the air. He turned to the table. The infants were still there, small and silent. He studied them for a moment. He went to his bedroll, from which he'd taken the coverings for Lydia, and pulled out a thick, folded blanket. It was beautiful. A Navajo weaving, its colors the deep, rich tones of the earth ochre, rust red, and a black as dark as a starless night, all woven in a pattern of sharp, interlocking diamonds. It was his one good blanket, kept clean and folded, not thrown on his cot. He spread it on the table near the fire, folding it twice to create a thick, soft pallet. He carefully, one by one, lifted the tiny bundles and placed them in the center of it, tucking the warm wool around them. They had a safe, worthy place. The cabin grew quieter. The wind's roar had descended into a low, mournful sigh. It was a defeated sound. Inside, the pine in the hearth popped and snapped, a cheerful, domestic noise that was the precise opposite of the storm. It was the sound of a steady pulse, of life continuing. On the cot, Lydia stirred. The warmth, the safety, the sudden absence of terror had finally allowed her body to register its own complete exhaustion. But she fought it. She pushed herself up on her elbows. The movement cost her. The room spun. She saw the fire tilt, and she fell back with a low groan. Rowan was there. He hadn't rushed. He'd simply moved. He'd grabbed a small, tightly bound bale of cured hay he kept for the goat in emergencies and wrapped it in a clean burlap sack. He slid it behind her back, propping her up against the log wall. It was stiff, prickly, and awkward, but it held her upright. She was finally able to see the cabin, the fire, the man. Her throat was raw. "Lydia," she whispered. The word was hoarse, a dry scrape, but it was clear. "My name. It's Lydia." He was checking the kettle, his back to her. He only nodded, a short, sharp dip of his chin. "Rowan." He said nothing else. He took a wooden bowl from the shelf and a spoon. He dipped a small amount of the broth he'd kept simmering in a pot at the edge of the hearth. It was thin, little more than salted water with a memory of venison, but it was hot. He brought it to her. Lydia's hand, the one that wasn't wrapped, lifted. It trembled violently, a palsy born of cold and shock. She tried to reach for the babies, just to touch them. Her fingers brushed the flannel. A feather-light, desperate caress. Rowan put the bowl in her left hand. He didn't try to feed her, but as she lifted the spoon, her elbow gave way. The tremor too strong. The hot soup sloshed, threatening to spill. Before it did, his hand was there. He didn't take the spoon. He cupped her elbow, his calloused, huge palm fitting against her arm, providing a foundation. He held her steady. He was a piece of the mountain, unwavering, and his strength flowed into her, stilling the tremor just enough. She got the spoon to her lips. The broth was hot, scalding, and it was the best thing she had ever tasted. It was life. It was a fire in her belly, a contrast to the ice that had lived there for days. She took another spoonful, and another. He stood there, holding her elbow, his gaze fixed on the bowl, not her face, granting her the dignity of feeding herself. When the bowl was empty, he took it and set it on the table. The ritual of the night began. The storm was a receding threat, but the cold was not. He moved to the cabin's single window, a small, 4-paned square that faced north. He lifted a heavy plank shutter from the floor and fitted it into the opening, slotting it into a deep wooden frame. The thud of the wood seating was final. It plunged the cabin into a deeper darkness, broken only by the bright, dancing light of the hearth. The last high-pitched whine of the wind was gone, muffled by the timber. The cabin was sealed. He went to the front door. He checked the iron latch, then lifted the bar, a heavy 4x4 beam of cured oak, and slid it into the two massive iron brackets bolted to the frame. The sound was a deep, solid clunk. It was the sound of absolute finality. Nothing was getting in. As he turned from the door, the firelight caught him. His shadow, immense and dark, was thrown across the room, covering the floor, the walls, and the low-beamed ceiling. It was the shadow of a guardian, a silent giant standing between them and the white world outside. Lydia's eyes, now clear, followed that shadow. Her mind, no longer numb with cold, began to work. She began to see. She saw the calendar. It was hanging on a nail by the hearth, a cheap almanac from a trading post. But it wasn't the days that held her attention. It was the marks beside each passing day. He had made a single, vertical slash in the paper with a piece of charcoal. Every seventh mark was a line drawn through the previous 6. The wall was covered in them. Weeks, months, years. She couldn't count them in the flickering light, but she saw the truth of it. This was not just a calendar. It was a record of endurance. It was the physical proof of a man who had been alone for a very, very long time. She looked around the rest of the cabin. It was brutally simple. The cot she lay on, the table, the 2 stools, the shelf, the pegs on the wall. But it was immaculate. The floor, though made of rough-hewn planking, was swept clean. The few tin plates and cups on the shelf were stacked, not thrown. The axe by the door was clean, its blade lightly oiled. His spare boots were set neatly, not kicked into a corner. It was not the den of a man who had resigned himself to solitude. It was the sparse, ordered, and prepared space of a man who was waiting. It was clean as if for a guest. It was arranged as if for someone who might arrive at any moment. Someone who, she realized, had never come. The silence in the cabin stretched, becoming comfortable. The babies slept, their tiny breaths almost invisible. The fire popped, a log settling. Lydia looked at the man, Rowan, who stood by the fire, staring into the flames, his back to her. Her voice was stronger now, bolstered by the soup and the heat. "What did you hear?" she asked, the words soft. He didn't turn. He seemed to be listening to the fire itself. "What did you hear?" she asked again. "In the storm, what made you stop?" Rowan was still for a long moment. His shadow on the wall was unmoving. He had heard the question. He was considering the truth of it. He finally spoke, his voice a low rumble, no louder than the fire. "Something that needed me." The dawn was a smear of wet ash. After the fury of the night, the silence was heavy, almost suffocating. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a world sculpted in white. The angles of the Iron Veil Range softened, the pines drooping under impossible loads of snow. The cabin was warm, the fire a steady, beating heart. The air smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and the faint, sweet scent of warm milk. Lydia was propped against the burlap-wrapped hay, her bandaged wrists resting on the blanket. The raw, abraded skin throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. But the linen was clean, and the salve Maribel had sent over had cooled the burning. She had sipped broth, and later, weak coffee sweetened with a dollop of molasses. The terror had receded, leaving a vast, hollow exhaustion. But with the gray light, the memories, and the fear returned. Rowan sat on his stool by the hearth, not looking at her. He was working. He had a long, heavy-bladed skinning knife and a whetstone. He spat on the stone and began to draw the blade across it. The sound was rhythmic, metallic, a counterpoint to the soft crackle of the fire. It was the only sound in the cabin for nearly an hour. The babies, fed and warm, slept on their Navajo blanket pallet. His name is Barnaby Cross. Lydia's voice was low, rough from disuse. The knife didn't stop. Shk, shk. He owns the mercantile in Copper Spur. But that's not his real business. His real business is rifles and influence. She stared at her hands. I was an orphan, working for my keep at the boarding house. He needed a wife. On paper, he said. She swallowed, the memory thick in her throat. He said it would give him a respectable front. He was trying to get the mail contract. A family man looks better, he said, and I would have a home. No more scrubbing floors for scraps. It seemed practical. She looked up, her eyes finding Rowan's back. He was a wall of flannel and muscle, his attention seemingly devoted entirely to the perfect, lethal edge he was putting on the steel. It wasn't a marriage. It was an agreement. But the paper made it real. It made me his. He was cold. He liked things orderly. He didn't like noise. He didn't like bother. She paused, her breath catching. Then I found out I was with child. I hoped, for a little while, it might change things, that it might soften him, make it real. A bitter, dry laugh escaped her. It was a terrible sound. He was angry. It was an inconvenience, a complication to his business, but he tolerated it. Until they were born, until the midwife told him. 2, and both of them girls. The cabin was silent save for the shk of the blade. He came to the room. I was holding them. I thought they were beautiful. He didn't even look at them. He just looked at me. His face was white. He said, her voice cracked, and she stopped. She took a breath, forcing the words out. He said, burdens, 2 more useless mouths, a drain on resources. He said I had failed him, that I had done it on purpose, just to spite him. She touched her bandaged wrist, her fingers tracing the linen. He didn't do it himself. He had his men, the ones who worked the freight wagons. He told them to teach me a lesson, to show me what happens to property that doesn't behave. They didn't use rope. They used baling twine, the kind with the wire in it. They said it was a punishment for my failure. They left me in the woodshed for hours. It was so cold. Shh. The sound of the knife on the stone was steady, unwavering, but as she spoke the word twine, Rowan's hand stopped. It was for less than a heartbeat. A single, thick cord of muscle in his temple, just beneath his hairline, jumped. It was a small, violent spasm, the only sign that he had heard, that he had understood. Then his hand moved again. The rhythm was unbroken. I knew I couldn't stay, she whispered. I knew what he would do. Not to me. To them, he would give them away. Or worse, just let them fade. I waited. He left for Dry Lantern to trade rifles with the miners. I took them, and a sack. And I ran. I ran into the hills. I didn't know about the blizzard. I just knew I had to get away from the valley. She let out a long, shuddering breath. The story was told. That's not all, she said, her voice dropping, gaining a new, sharper edge of fear. Before I left, my cousin, she works at the telegraph office in Copper Spur. She got a message to me. Barnaby has already filed papers. He has a document. He's telling the territorial judge I'm unstable, that I'm unfit. He's claiming full, legal guardianship. She looked at him, her eyes wide with a fresh, dawning horror. He's not just chasing a runaway wife. Rowan, he's coming to legally take my children. The sharpening stopped. Rowan lifted the blade, holding it up to the firelight. He squinted, examining the edge. He wiped it clean on a piece of buckskin, the leather dark with oil. He tested the razor-fine edge with the pad of his thumb. Satisfied, he slid the knife into the sheath on his belt with a soft, final shunk. He stood. His shadow once again swallowed the room. Come, he said. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't offer sympathy or rage. He offered logistics. He led her to the back of the cabin. to the wall half built into the sod of the hillside, a massive, neat stack of firewood, enough for a month, was piled there. He put his shoulder to it and shoved. The entire stack, built on a heavy wooden sled, slid smoothly away from the wall. Behind it, almost invisible, was a low, narrow door, braced with iron. He lifted the bar and pulled it open. Cold, earthy air spilled out. It was a dugout, a small cellar cut deep into the hill. It smelled of oats, leather, and horse. Inside, Lydia could see a second horse, a lean, nervous-looking bay, already saddled. Bags of oats were stacked against one wall, along with 2 full canteens and several oilcloth-wrapped parcels. "She's fast," Rowan said, his voice a low rumble in the enclosed space. "Faster than Boulder. The trail starts 50 yards behind the cabin. It follows the creek bed. South. It's overgrown, hidden from the main valley. It'll take you to the pass at Raven Switchback. From there it's a hard ride, but it'll get you out of the territory." He was giving her an escape. He had prepared this, not for her, she realized, but for himself. He had a way out, and he was giving it to her. They stepped back into the warmth of the cabin. Rowan slid the wood pile back into place. The dugout was hidden once more. Lydia felt a strange, dizzying mix of relief and despair. He was helping her run. Her eyes drifted to the mantelpiece, the rough-hewn log that served as a shelf above the fire. There were 2 objects there she hadn't noticed before, half hidden by a tin of matches. They were small, flat pieces of pine, the wood still pale and fresh. They had been carved recently, the night before, she realized. While she and the babies slept, he had sat by the fire with this knife. The lettering was rough, gouged deep, but it was clear. On one piece of wood, Mabel, on the other, Junia. She stared at them. He had heard her children crying in the storm. He had saved them. And then, in the quiet of the night, this silent, solitary man had looked at their sleeping faces and had given them names. He hadn't asked her. He hadn't waited. He had simply seen them as people, as individuals who deserved a name to mark their place in the world. She reached out, her fingers trembling. She didn't touch the wood. She just hovered her hand over the carved letters of Mabel. All the fear, the pain, the cold, it all gave way to a sudden, crushing wave of emotion so powerful it stole her breath. Barnaby had called them burdens. This stranger, this mountain recluse, had called them Mabel and Junia. She turned away from him. A sharp, ragged sound caught in her throat. She pressed her forehead against the rough wood of the window frame. Her shoulders began to shake in a silent, violent tremor. She bit down, hard, on her lower lip. The pain a sharp, grounding anchor. It wasn't the sting of the cold this time. It was the deep, flooding ache of a gratitude so profound it hurt. Rowan let her have the moment. He went to a peg on the wall and took down one of his old flannel shirts. It was worn thin at the elbows. The blue-checked pattern faded from 100 washings. But it was clean. He laid it on the table. With the same knife he had just sharpened, he cut the shirt into neat squares. "They'll need changing," he said, his voice quiet, pulling her back. She turned, wiping her face with the back of her unbandaged hand. She watched as he took one of the squares and began to fold it. His hands, which she had seen handle an axe, lift her as if she were a child, and sharpen a blade to a killing edge, now moved with an unexpected, practical deftness. He folded the cloth into a thick, serviceable triangle. "Like this," he said. He showed her how to place it, how to fold the corners. As he turned the cloth, one of the small, brass buttons on the old shirt cuff caught the light from the fire. It gleamed for a second, a tiny, dull spark, a small, simple promise of warmth, of care, of the next hour. Just as she was reaching for the folded cloth, a sharp, hard knock echoed through the cabin. It wasn't a social call, it was a summons. Rowan's hand was instantly on his knife. He motioned for Lydia to move back. into the shadows by the cot, shielding the babies with her body. He moved to the door. He didn't open it. "Who is it?" he called, his voice flat. "It's Mara Bell. Rowan. Let me in. It's urgent." He slid the heavy bar back and opened the door just enough for her to slip through. Mara Bell, the town seamstress, entered in a swirl of snow and cold air. She was a small, tough woman in her 50s, her face lined like a dried apple, her eyes sharp and intelligent. She was wrapped in a thick wool shawl. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. She brushed the snow from her shoulders, her gaze finding Lydia and the babies. She nodded, a grim sign of respect. She carried a small, oilcloth-wrapped parcel. "Heard you had visitors," she said. She walked to the table and unwrapped the bundle. Inside were thick, real linen bandages, a small blue tin of medicated salve, and 2 tiny, knitted woolen caps. Figured you'd need these more than the mercantile. Lydia could only whisper, "Thank you." Mara waved it off. Her face darkened. "That's not why I'm here. I came the long way. Up the creek. Not the road. Barnaby's back." Lydia's blood went cold. "He rode in from Dry Lantern an hour ago," Mara said, her voice low and fast. "He's telling everyone in Copper Spur you've gone mad, that you stole his children and ran off into the blizzard. He's got his paper, signed and sealed by that drunkard Justice O'Keefe." Rowan, who had been rebarring the door, turned. "O'Keefe's seal isn't worth the whiskey he trades it for." "Maybe not to you," Mara snapped, "but it looks legal enough to the timid, and that's not the worst of it." She leaned in, her eyes boring into Rowan's. "He's hired help. 4 men. He met them on the road. They're riders from Skull Canyon. They ain't lawmen. Rowan, they're retrievers, the kind who fetch things for a price, and they don't care if the thing is breathing when they get it back." Mara retied her shawl. "They were buying ammunition and whiskey when I left. They'll wait for the worst of the snow to settle, but they'll be riding. He won't wait for a real judge. He's coming here." She opened the door, looked out into the gray afternoon, and then back at Lydia. "God keep you, child." She was gone. Rowan slid the heavy oak bar back into its iron brackets. The thud was louder this time. It wasn't the sound of safety. It was the sound of a gate closing. The cabin, which hours ago had been a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. The escape route through the dugout was one option, but could Lydia and 2 newborn infants survive a desperate ride through a high mountain pass in the dead of winter? Lydia looked down at Mabel and Junia, now sleeping peacefully, one of them wearing a tiny, soft woolen cap. Rowan was right. It wasn't just about survival anymore. Barnaby had twisted the law, turned it into a cudgel. This was no longer a chase. It was a siege. And the fight wasn't just for her life. It was for her right to be their mother. Mara Bell's departure left a new kind of cold in the cabin. It wasn't the seeping frost of the blizzard. It was the metallic chill of certainty. The threat was no longer a vague he, but a named man. Barnaby Cross, backed by a false paper and 4 hired riders from Skull Canyon. Rowan did not waste a moment on words. His grief, his rage, whatever he felt, was channeled into a silent, kinetic energy. He was a man of the high, lonely places, and he thought like one. He didn't see a cabin, he saw a defensive position. He didn't see a porch, he saw a kill zone. He pulled on his heavy coat and went outside. The air was biting, the new fallen snow a pristine, deadly blanket that covered everything in a deceptive softness. Lydia watched him from the single, now unshuttered window. He moved to the small porch. From a leather satchel, he took a long coil of thin twine, the same kind he used for snares. He also produced a small cloth bag that jingled. He knelt in the snow, his gloved hands working with precision. He strung the twine low, no more than 6 inches off the porch deck, stretching it between the support posts, looping it in a nearly invisible web. On each length of twine, he tied a small brass bell, the kind trappers put on their packs to warn off bears. He was building an alarm. Anyone stepping onto that porch in the dark, or in a rush, would hit the lines. The sound would be small, but in the mountain silence, it would be as loud as a gunshot. Lydia watched him test it, his finger flicking the line. A tiny, sharp ting cut the air. He nodded. Next, he went to the massive wood pile stacked against the north wall of the cabin, the one that hid the cellar door. But he didn't go to the door. He went to the side, to a section of wood that was stacked with a strange, deliberate gap behind it. He pulled away several heavy logs of pine and aspen. Behind them, cut into the thick cabin wall, was a small, square hole, just large enough for a rifle barrel, a firing port. It was perfectly disguised. From the outside, it was just a shadow in a stack of wood. From the inside, it gave a clear, flanking view of the entire front porch and the clearing beyond. He had built this cabin not just for shelter, but for defense. This was not his first thought of violence. He went back inside, his beard rimmed with new frost. He didn't look at Lydia. He went to his rifle, a heavy Sharps, which rested on pegs over the hearth. He checked its action, his movements economical. Then he did something that confused her. He looked at the window, then at the fire, and then at the far wall. He was gauging the wind, the light, the very air in the room. He picked up his axe and went back outside. Lydia moved to the window. He walked about 50 yards from the cabin, to a small clearing where a dead, lightning-struck pine stood. He studied the wind, which was coming steadily from the northwest, a cross breeze that swept across the front of the cabin. He paced a small area, kicked the snow, and then, with 2 powerful swings, he used the flat of his axe to slam a wooden marker deep into the frozen ground. He came back in, stamping the snow from his boots. "What was that?" Lydia asked, her voice quiet. Rowan hung the axe on its pegs. "The wind," he said, as if that explained everything. He saw her confusion and elaborated, his voice low. "Wind plays tricks with sound up here, makes it bounce. That spot a shot fired from there will sound like 3. It'll echo off the ridge, and the wind will carry it back. Makes 2 men sound like 10. It's a place to make noise." He was planning to intimidate them, to use the mountains themselves as an ally. This wasn't just a defense, it was a strategy. The escape, however, was her job. While he fortified the cabin, Lydia knelt by the fire, checking the oilcloth pack he had given her. The contents were grimly practical. A small sack of dried goat's milk, painfully milked from the nanny in the lean-to. A half-dozen hard corn cakes, dense and heavy as stones, but packed with energy. A small tin of the salve Mara had brought, and the knife. Rowan had handed it to her earlier, a small, simple folding knife with a bone handle. "You keep this," he'd said, "not for protection. Just, you keep this." It was heavy in her hand. It was the first weapon she had ever held. She clicked it open and shut, the sound a small, sharp snick in the quiet. She was packing for a journey she prayed she would never have to take. "They'll look for tracks," Rowan said, his voice pulling her from her thoughts. He was standing over her. "They'll circle the cabin. They'll expect you to run south, toward the pass." "The false trail," she said, remembering the escape route. "We make one," he said. "But not yet. We wait. When they get close, then we make it. Give them something fresh to follow." He knelt, his size opposite her making the cabin feel smaller. "How?" she asked. I can't walk out there." "You won't have to." He showed her. He took his own boots and showed her how to press them into the hearth ash. Heel first, to mimic a lighter, stumbling step. "You make the prints from the cellar door. Just a few yards. Stumble. Look like you're in a hurry. Look like you're carrying burdens." He used the word Barnaby had used, but his voice was flat, clinical, stripping it of its cruelty and turning it into a tactical descriptor. "Drag your feet here. Fall to one knee here. They'll find it. They'll believe it. They'll follow it. It'll send them right up the switchback to Ravens. It'll cost them half a day." They practiced, there on the floor. using the soot and ash. He was teaching her deception. He was teaching her to think like the hunted. He stood, satisfied, and went to the small table where he had carved the names. He pulled out a piece of paper scarce and valuable, an ink pot, and a pen. His large, calloused fingers, which had just taught her to fake a trail, now looked clumsy holding the delicate pen. He wrote. The scratching of the nib was loud. The note was short, only a few lines. He folded it and dripped a small bead of wax to seal it. "Who is that for?" Lydia asked. "Deputy Calder Pike," Rowan said. He didn't look up. "He's the county man. He's slow, but he's honest. He's the only one who might listen to our side before Barnaby's money does." "But how will you send it? You can't leave." "Mara," he said. "When she came, she brought bandages. I gave her the message. She has her ways. She'll get it to Pike's desk in Gallatin. It's a chance. It's the law. We use it if we can." He had done it right in front of her, and she hadn't even seen the exchange. Mara's visit wasn't just a warning. It was a conspiracy. The last of the gray light died. The sun vanished behind the iron veils, and the world was plunged into a deep, blue-black cold. Rowan barred the door. This time for the night, he put the heavy shutter in the window, sealing them in. The cabin was a fortress. It was a shelter. It was a prison. The only light was the fire. It cast long, dancing shadows. Rowan sat on his stool, his sharps rifle across his lap, cleaning it, checking the mechanism again and again. He was not a man who trusted to luck. Lydia sat on the cot. The tension was a physical thing, a weight in the air that made it hard to breathe. The babies, fed and warm, were nestled beside her. Mabel and Junia. She looked at their perfect, sleeping faces. She felt a sudden, desperate need to give them something normal, something other than fear and firelight and the smell of rifle oil. Her voice was barely a whisper, trembling at first. She began to recite the alphabet, the way her own mother had, years ago. She turned it into a soft, tuneless song. "A," she hummed. "A is for apple, red on the tree. BB is for baby, just like you, both of you." Rowan, who had been outside for a final check of the bell lines, froze on the porch. He stood in the absolute, freezing darkness, hidden. He heard her voice, thin and clear, drift through the thick log walls. "CC is for cabin, safe and warm." He stood there for a long time, listening. The sound of her voice, the sound of civilization, of innocence. In this place he had built for solitude and survival. It was a sound that did not belong. He closed his eyes. His jaw was tight, his lips pursed, as if he had just swallowed a mouthful of hot coals. He was branding the why of this fight onto his soul. He came back inside, his face a mask of stone. He slid the heavy bar into place. The final thud echoed in the room. He sat on his stool, the rifle back across his lap. The fire popped. Mabel made a small, snuffling sound in her sleep. The silence stretched. Lydia looked at this man, this stranger who had saved them, who had given her children names, who was now preparing to stand between them and 4 hired guns. She had to know. "Rowan." His eyes, dark in the firelight, lifted to meet hers. "If they come," she said, her voice shaking. "If Barnaby comes and the paper from the deputy doesn't stop him." She took a breath. Will you kill for us?" It was a terrible question, a thing a woman should never have to ask. Rowan did not look away. He didn't look at his rifle. He looked at her. He let the question hang in the air, giving it its full, awful weight. He spoke, his voice slow, each word chosen, each word as solid as the foundation stones of the cabin. "I will do," he said, "everything righteous to stop violence from winning." It wasn't a yes. It was something more. It wasn't a promise of vengeance. It was a creed. It was the answer of a man who lived by a code she was only just beginning to understand. He would not start a fight. He would not seek blood. But he would, by all righteous means, end one. The line was clear in his mind. This was not a blind revenge. It was protection. It was a gray, frontier morality, born of necessity and isolation. Lydia looked down at his hands, which rested on the dark wood of the rifle stock. They were scarred, the knuckles broad, the palms and fingers layered with calluses from the axe, the knife, the reins. They were hands that could clear a forest, skin a deer, or, she now knew, carve a child's name into a piece of pine. She saw it then. The strength in him was not the brutal, careless strength of Barnaby Cross. It was a different thing entirely. It was the deep, patient, and terrifying strength of the mountain itself. It was strength held in check, a kindness that was restrained, and, for that very reason, infinitely more powerful. She nodded. Once, she understood. She didn't need to ask again. The first sound was not the trample of hooves. It was a single, sharp ting. In the pressurized silence of the cabin, the sound was as loud as a hammer blow on an anvil. Rowan, who had been sitting upright on the stool for hours, was on his feet before the echo died. His eyes met Lydia's. The trap, the bell line on the porch. He moved to the window, peering through the small gap between the shutter and the frame. At the edge of the clearing, where the pines met the snowfield, shapes were moving. 4 riders. They had dismounted, tethering their horses in the deep shadows of the trees, and were now advancing on foot, as if summoned by their arrival. The sky, which had been a clear, cold gray, changed. The wind, which had been a low moan, suddenly rose in pitch, screaming down from the Iron Vale peaks. A new, localized squall, a freakish late-afternoon blizzard, began to swirl, the snow not falling, but whipping horizontally. Nature had just provided an ally. "Lydia, the bin!" Rowan said, his voice a low command. He didn't move to the door. He moved to the other cellar, the one hidden by the wood pile. He slid the heavy sled of logs aside, revealing the low door. He didn't open it. He grabbed a heavy oilcloth, the one meant for the escape, and a bundle of spare rags. "What are you doing?" Lydia's voice was a strained whisper. "Buying time," he growled. He opened the dugout door. The nervous bay horse whinnied softly. Rowan ignored it. He went to the third horse, a shaggy scrub pony he kept for packing. He threw a light saddle on it. He didn't bother with the cinch. He wrapped the rags into a crude, infant-sized bundle and tied it securely to the saddle horn with the oilcloth. He led the pony out of the dugout, pulling it around to the south-facing side of the cabin, keeping the structure between him and the advancing men. The wind tore at them, a wall of ice pellets. "Go!" he yelled. He slapped the pony hard on the rump. The horse, spooked by the storm and the slap, bolted. It plunged into the snowdrifts, heading instinctively for the only other trail it knew, the high-pass route, the one that led to Raven's Switchback. It was a perfect decoy. A lone horse, carrying a small, oilcloth-wrapped bundle, fleeing south. Rowan slammed the dugout door, slid the woodpile back, and was inside the cabin in seconds. "They'll see it. They'll have to split up or follow it. Now, you go!" Lydia was already moving. In the center of the cabin, what passed for the kitchen floor, lay a threadbare bearskin rug. Rowan kicked it aside. Beneath it was a thick, flush-mounted trap door with an iron ring. He heaved it open. A wave of cold, earthy air rose to meet them. It was a root cellar, a dark, shallow hole lined with stone, smelling of damp earth and potatoes. It was not the escape route. It was a hiding place. "In," he said. Lydia looked at the black square, and her breath hitched. It was the cleft in the rock. It was the ice. It was a grave. "Lydia." Rowan's voice was firm, but not unkind. "It's dry. It's safe. It's the only place they won't look." She nodded. her fear overcome by the immediate, physical threat of the men outside. She clutched Mabel and Junia, their tiny bodies warm against her. She sat on the edge and lowered herself into the darkness. Rowan handed her the Navajo blanket and a canteen of water. "Slide the lid back on," he said. "It's heavy. Use your back. Do not open it. Not until I come for you, no matter what you hear." "Rowan," she started. "He's here," Rowan said. He had heard the crunch of boots on the porch steps. Lydia grabbed the iron ring from the inside. She pulled. The heavy door scraped shut, plunging her into absolute darkness. The sound of the wind and the world above suddenly muffled, distant. Rowan didn't wait to see it close. He kicked the bearskin rug back over the door and, as an afterthought, grabbed a small, half-empty sack of potatoes and tossed it on top of the rug, completing the disguise. He turned to the main door. He took a deep breath. He checked his knife. He did not take his rifle. He slid the heavy oak bar from its brackets. The wind tore the door from his hand, slamming it open against the cabin wall. 4 men stood on his porch, their forms blurred by the driving snow. 3 were rough-looking, draped in buffalo hides and armed with rifles. The 4th was Barnaby Cross. Cross was a mercantile man. He was soft in the middle, his face pale and fleshy, his small eyes darting nervously. He wore a town coat, ridiculously inadequate for the storm, and was already shaking with cold and rage. "Hargrove!" Barnaby shouted, his voice thin against the gale. "I'm here by the authority of the Copper Spur Council. I'm here according to town law." Rowan stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door shut behind him. He stood with his hands empty, his arms hanging loose at his sides. The wind whipped his hair and stung his face. He looked not at Barnaby, but at the 3 hired men. He calculated. "This ain't Copper Spur," Rowan said, his voice a low rumble that cut through the wind. "And town law doesn't mean a thing up here." "I have a writ," Barnaby screamed, fumbling inside his coat. He pulled out a piece of paper. It was already wet, the ink running. "A writ of guardianship signed by Justice O'Keefe. These children are my property. She is unfit." "Your paper's worthless," Rowan said calmly, his eyes still on the men. "O'Keefe's signature is good for a free drink in Dry Lantern. And that's all. This is Gallatin County. You have no standing. This is my land, and you're trespassing." "He's lying," Barnaby shrieked at his men. "Get her, get the children!" One of the hired men, a big bearded man with a hot temper, had heard enough. He didn't care about paper. "I'm done with this." He moved, but not to shoot. He intended to end the conversation. He lunged, swinging his heavy rifle like a club. The thick wooden butt aimed directly at the side of Rowan's head. Rowan didn't retreat. He didn't block. He moved in. He took a short, half-step back, just enough for the rifle butt to whistle past his ear, missing by an inch. The man was overextended, his balance thrown. Before the man could recover, Rowan pivoted on his heel. He didn't strike. He moved, using the man's own momentum against him. He brought his left arm up, catching the man's swinging arm at the elbow, and clamped his right hand down on the wrist. He turned his hips, locking the arm straight, and simply leaned. There was a wet pop as the man's shoulder was forced beyond its limit. The man screamed, a high, thin sound, and his fingers opened, dropping the rifle. Rowan completed the turn, and the man, now unarmed and broken, was thrown bodily from the porch, landing face down in a deep snowdrift. He didn't move. It had taken less than 2 seconds. The other 2 Skull Canyon riders stared, their rifles half raised, shocked by the sudden, brutal efficiency. Barnaby Cross panicked. His hand dove inside his coat and came out with a small, nickel-plated revolver. He leveled it, his hand shaking violently, at Rowan's chest. I'll shoot. I swear I'll—" Crack! The shot was deafening, but it didn't come from Barnaby's revolver. It came from the dark, shuttered window of the cabin. Lydia had not gone straight down. She had seen Barnaby draw. The bullet, fired from Rowan's Sharp's rifle, tore a fist-sized chunk of wood from the porch rafter, just 6 inches above Barnaby's head. A shower of splinters and heavy, packed snow from the roof rained down on the men. Barnaby screamed and dropped to his knees, clutching his head, and at that exact moment, the storm, their ally, struck again. A vicious sideways gust of wind tore across the porch. It hit the 2 torches the remaining men were holding. The flames flared, sputtered, and died. Thump! The world was plunged into a swirling gray-white chaos. "Now!" Rowan bellowed. He stomped his left boot, hard, on the porch deck. A thin wire, stretched taut from the spot, snapped. It tipped a small, clay oil pot that Rowan had rigged to the railing, hidden in the shadows. The lamp tipped, and a pint of thick, smoky lantern oil spilled onto the hot stones of the chimney base that formed the porch's foundation. It didn't explode. It vaporized. A thick, acrid cloud of oily black smoke erupted, instantly mixing with the swirling snow. It created a solid, choking wall of impenetrable smog, blinding everyone on the porch. Rowan didn't hesitate. He dove back, grabbing the cabin door, using the smoke as his own cover. He heard Lydia on the other side of the wall scramble into the cellar. He heard the heavy final scrape of the wooden trap door sliding shut. They were safe. The porch was in chaos. The 2 riders were coughing, their eyes streaming. "I can't see," one yelled. "He's in the smoke!" "The woman's armed!" the other shouted, pulling his companion from the snowdrift. The man was moaning, his arm hanging uselessly. "Forget this. Cross!" one of them yelled. "This ain't what you paid for. The man's a devil, and the woman's a sniper." Barnaby scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of snow, smoke, and terror. He grabbed his revolver from the snow. "You can't, you're paid." "We're paid to retrieve, not to get killed in a haunted blizzard. We're leaving." The 2 men dragged their injured companion off the porch and disappeared into the swirling white, running for their horses. Barnaby Cross stood alone for a moment, blinded by the smoke, defeated by the wind. He looked at the dark, silent cabin. "This isn't over! Hargrove!" he shrieked, his voice cracking with fury and humiliation. "You hear me? This isn't over. I'll be back. I'll get a real warrant. I'll get a warrant from the judge in Gallatin, and I'll bring 10 men 20. Those children are mine." He turned and fled, stumbling and falling in the drifts, chasing after his hired guns. The wind howled. The smoke slowly thinned, whipped away by the gale. The porch was empty. The only signs of the fight were the fallen rifle, half buried in the snow, and the spatters of oil on the stones. Rowan stood inside the silent cabin, his back against the barred door, his chest heaving. He listened until the last sound of Barnaby's retreat was swallowed by the storm. He looked up, his eyes, dark and cold, fixed on the new splintered gash in the porch rafter, the pale, raw wood exposed by Lydia's bullet. The battle was won, but he knew, with a certainty that settled in his bones, that the war had just begun. The next morning, the world was painfully bright. The new snow acted as a mirror, reflecting a merciless sun that did nothing to warm the air. The gash in the porch rafter was a raw, yellow wound against the dark, seasoned logs. At precisely 10 o'clock, a lone rider approached. He wasn't riding fast. He was a man who, in his line of work, had learned that rushing got you killed, either by a bullet or by a patch of unseen ice. This was Deputy Calder Pike. He was a tall, stooped man, his shoulders permanently rounded from decades of wearing a heavy coat and the heavier burden of the law in a lawless land. His face was a map of exhaustion, his mustache gray and stained with tobacco. He rode up to the porch, his eyes taking in everything, the cleared snow, the dark stain of oil on the stones, the fallen rifle now half buried, and the fresh, splintered wood above his head. He looked at Rowan, who stood in the doorway, and simply sighed. "Hargrove," Pike said, his voice a dry rasp. He dismounted, his movements stiff. You've had a busy night. They were on my land. Deputy, uninvited, Rowan said, his voice flat. So I heard. Pike pulled a folded paper from his coat. Got a wire from Gallatin, and another from Barnaby Cross in Copper Spur. His story is different from the one Maribel's boy shouted at me at 3 a.m. He handed the paper to Rowan. This is an order of status quo from the circuit judge. It means nobody moves. It means you don't go anywhere. It means Mr. Cross doesn't come back up here with more men. He looked past Rowan, into the cabin, where Lydia sat on the cot. The baby's in her arms, and it means she stays here, with the children. For now. It wasn't a victory, it was a ceasefire. He'll be back, Deputy, Lydia said, her voice quiet but clear from the shadows. He won't stop. Pike pinched the bridge of his nose. Ma'am, right now. I have 2 competing claims. Mr. Cross has a writ of guardianship, signed by Justice O'Keefe over in Dry Lantern. O'Keefe, Rowan said, his voice sharp with contempt. O'Keefe would sign his own death warrant for a $10 bottle of rye. Be that as it may, Pike said, irritation creeping into his voice. It's got a stamp. It looks legal. He says his wife has gone unsound, that she stole his children and is being held by you. Does this look unsound to you, Deputy? Lydia's voice was sharp, and she stepped forward into the light. She held out a small, folded piece of paper, stained and wrinkled, but intact. Pike took it. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning the lines. What's this? That, Lydia said, is a birth receipt from Inez Caro, the midwife in Copper Spur. It's dated. It notes the birth of 2 female infants, and it notes my condition, exhausted, in fear, and showing signs of physical distress. That was before I ran. I asked her to write that. I paid her my last $2 to write it down and sign it. Pike read the paper again, his expression hardening. This was a direct contradiction to Barnaby's claim. As if on cue, a second rider appeared, Mara Bell. She rode her mule right up to the porch step. I'm here to make a statement, Deputy, Mara said, not waiting to be asked. I heard Barnaby Cross with my own ears not 2 weeks ago. He was in his own mercantile, furious about the birth. He said, and I quote, that he would sooner throw all 3 of them into the snow than raise a pair of useless burdens. Pike's face went grim. Mara, that's hearsay. It's motive. Calder. Mara snapped. And it's the God's honest truth. You know me. Do I lie? Pike looked at the midwife's note. He looked at Mara's resolute, angry face. He looked at the gash in the wood, and at Rowan, who stood like a mountain, silent and imposing. Then he thought of Barnaby's writ, signed by a drunkard in a backwater town. This is a mess. Pike breathed. O'Keefe's writ has no jurisdiction up here. Not really, but Cross's claim of marriage that complicates it. This is county business now. District business. Rowan, who had been silent, finally spoke. Then move it, he said. Get it out of Copper Spur. Get it out of Dry Lantern. Move the hearing to the district court in Gallatin, in front of a real judge. Pike looked at Rowan, surprised. A recluse. Demanding a court hearing. Rowan, you know what that means. That means you and her and those babies have to ride to Gallatin. You have to stand in a public room, in front of everyone. We'll be there, Rowan said. Pike nodded slowly, a look of weary respect in his eyes. He folded Lydia's receipt and tucked it into his own pocket. All right, I'll file the motion. The hearing will be in Gallatin. Judge Alistair Blackwood. He's fair, but he's hard. He doesn't suffer fools, and he hates a mess. I'll set the hearing for 10 days from now. Until then, he said, fixing Rowan with a hard stare. This status quo holds. You see Barnaby Cross? You are to walk away. You let the law handle it. And if the law doesn't? Rowan asked. You let it handle it anyway. Pike said. He mounted his horse. 10 days. Gallatin. Be there. The 10 days were a new kind of siege, not of violence, but of whispers. Barnaby Cross, furious at being thwarted and humiliated, had returned to Copper Spur and begun his own war. The rumors, delivered by Mara Bell during a brief, tense visit, were poison. Lydia Merritt had gone mad from childbirth. She was a danger to her own children. The recluse Hargrove, a man who hadn't spoken to a soul in 5 years, had kidnapped her, filled her head with the lies. He was a violent man, a mountain man who thought he was above the law. By the 5th day, the tide of public opinion in Copper Spur had turned completely against them. Lydia was no longer a victim. She was a hysterical woman. Rowan was no longer a rescuer. He was a kidnapper. In the cabin, the weight of the coming day was suffocating. Lydia spent her time caring for Mabel and Junia, her movements mechanical, her eyes distant. But in the evenings, when the babies slept, the fear would return. She stood in front of the small, fogged mirror that hung by the door, a small piece of flawed glass that Rowan used for shaving. She stared at her reflection. She saw a pale, thin woman with haunted eyes. She saw what Barnaby's lawyer would make them see. "He'll say I'm crazy," she whispered to the glass, her voice shaking. "He'll twist my words. He'll say I was unfit, that I endangered them by running into the storm." She practiced. "Your Honor, I left because I was in fear." "No, Your Honor. Barnaby Cross is a violent man." It all sounded weak, thin, desperate. Rowan, who had been oiling the harness for the trip, stopped. He stood behind her, his reflection a dark, massive shadow looming over her own. She turned, her eyes filled with panic. "Rowan, what do I say? How do I make them believe me? How do I fight his lies?" Rowan looked at her, his expression unreadable in the dim firelight. He thought for a moment, not about the law, or the judge, or Barnaby, but about her. "You don't fight his lies," he said, his voice low and steady. "You just tell the truth. You tell them what happened. You tell them about the twine. You tell them about the rock. You don't need to practice. You just remember." He handed her a clean, damp cloth. "The truth is heavier than a lie. It'll land." The day of the hearing, the Gallatin District Courtroom was packed. It wasn't a real courtroom, but a large, converted land office, the air thick with the smell of wet wool, stale tobacco, and unwashed bodies. Barnaby Cross had brought half of Copper Spur with him, and they filled the benches, their faces a mixture of curiosity and open hostility. Barnaby sat at the front table with a slick-haired lawyer from Helena. He looked the part of the aggrieved husband. His suit was pressed, his face set in a mask of sorrowful, righteous anger. Rowan and Lydia entered from the side door. As Pike had instructed, Rowan carried Junia, wrapped tightly. Lydia carried Mabel. A low, hostile murmur rippled through the crowd. Rowan ignored it, his eyes fixed forward, and found them 2 chairs against the wall. He did not sit, but stood behind Lydia's chair. A silent, unmoving guardian. "All rise," a bailiff yelled. Judge Alistair Blackwood entered. He was a small, wire-thin man with a beard like iron filings and eyes that missed nothing. He sat, slammed his gavel once, and the room fell silent. "This is a preliminary hearing," Blackwood said, his voice a sharp bark. "Matter of guardianship. Cross versus Well, the docket is unclear, versus Lydia Merritt. I have 2 conflicting writs, one from a town justice in Dry Lantern, which holds no water in this court, and one from Deputy Pike, citing imminent danger. Mr. Cross, your lawyer may begin." For 20 minutes, the lawyer spun a tale. He painted Lydia as a fragile, hysterical woman, prone to dark fantasies, who had been unduly influenced by the reclusive and notoriously antisocial Rowan Hargrove. He presented the marriage certificate. He spoke of a husband's rights, of a father's concern. All Mr. Cross wants," the lawyer concluded, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "is to bring his wife home and get her the help she needs, and to secure the safety of his children." Judge Blackwood looked at Lydia. "Mrs. Merritt, do you have a reply to this? Do you have representation?" "I have no lawyer, Your Honor," Lydia said. Her voice trembled, but it carried in the silent room. I only have the truth." "Then stand and give it," the judge said. Lydia stood. She held Mabel in the crook of her left arm, her bandaged right wrist resting on the blanket. She did not look at Barnaby. She looked at the judge. "His lawyer is right about one thing," Lydia began, her voice gaining strength. "I was not well after the birth. I was in fear, because when Mr. Cross learned that I had given him 2 daughters, he called them burdens." The room was still. He said I had failed him, and he had his men punish me." She held up her bandaged right wrist. "They used baling twine, the kind with wire in it. They tied me in a woodshed for hours." A woman in the back row gasped. Barnaby's lawyer leapt to his feet. "Objection! This is slanderous. She is hysterical." "Sit down," Judge Blackwood snapped, his eyes never leaving Lydia. "Continue, Mrs. Merritt." "I knew I had to run," Lydia said, her voice dropping, tears welling, but not falling. "I took my babies and I ran. I ran into the storm. I didn't know it was coming. I just ran. I found a cleft in the rock by Blue Wind Creek. The snow, it was so cold. I held them. I tried to keep them warm. I was waiting to die." The entire room had stopped breathing. The hostile faces were gone, replaced by expressions of stunned, horrified silence. "But my children," they cried. "They let out one small sound, and Mr. Hargrove, he heard them. He was checking his traps. He heard them in the storm. He found us. He brought us to his cabin. He warmed us. He fed us. He did not ask for a single thing. He just saved us." She looked at Barnaby, her gaze finally meeting his. It was not fear, it was ice. "He wants to secure their safety. Your Honor, my husband, who sent me into a blizzard with raw wrists. This man, Rowan Hargrove, who heard a cry in a storm and answered it. Who do you think is the danger?" She finished. The silence in the room was absolute. It was a physical, ringing void. Judge Blackwood stared at Lydia for a long, hard moment. He looked at Barnaby Cross, whose mask of sorrow had been replaced by a white, seething fury. "Mr. Cross," the judge said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You come into my court with a worthless piece of paper from a drunkard, accusing this woman of instability, and I find she is the only person here who has spoken a single, verifiable truth." He lifted his gavel. "This court finds that a clear and present danger exists to Lydia Merritt and her infant children. I am issuing a temporary order of protection. Barnaby Cross, you are hereby barred from coming within 1 mile of Mrs. Merritt, the children, or the Hargrove property at Fallow Bend. Any attempt to do so will result in your immediate arrest." "Your Honor," Barnaby's lawyer shouted. "This hearing is concluded," Blackwood barked, slamming the gavel. Barnaby Cross stood. He looked at his lawyer, then at Rowan, who had not moved, and finally at Lydia. His face was pale, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. He turned, his shoulders rigid, and shoved his way through the silent, parting crowd. Lydia sagged against the chair, her legs giving way. Rowan put a hand on her shoulder, a brief, steadying pressure. They had won. It was a victory of paper. But as Lydia watched Barnaby disappear, she saw the look in his eyes. The law had stopped him, but it hadn't beaten him. The cold, smoky smell of violence hadn't left the room. It had just followed him out the door. The order of protection from Judge Blackwood bought them more than time. It bought them air. The suffocating tension of the siege was replaced by the thin, sharp air of a high mountain spring. The snow receded, first in patches, then in whole sheets. revealing the muddy, tender green of the fallow Bend Valley. The world, it seemed, was breathing again. But the cabin at Cedar Hollow was irrevocably changed. It was no longer the silent den of a recluse. It was a home, and a notorious one. Travelers, hearing the story in Copper Spur, would ride past, slowing their horses to stare at the cabin with the bullet-scarred porch. One afternoon, a half-frozen trapper, his face raw with windburn, stopped, his gaze lingering on the porch rafter. Rowan, who was outside splitting wood, saw the man's hunger. He didn't offer a word. He just went inside, ladled a steaming mug of the venison broth that was always on the hearth, and handed it to him. The man drank it, his eyes watering from the heat, nodded once, and rode on. Rowan looked at the pot. He looked at the porch. He took a hook, drove it into the main beam, and hung a large cast-iron pot over a permanent fire pit he built near the steps. From then on, the pot was always on, filled with a simple, hot broth or a thin stew. It became a local joke, then a landmark. Trappers, shepherds, and even the mail rider on his way to Gallatin began to call it the porch pot. It was a signal. The hermit of Cedar Hollow was in, and the fire was lit. Lydia, too, felt the need to build. She had been given sanctuary. Now, she would make one. Her first pupils were the 3 Basque shepherd children who drove their flocks into the high meadows. They were small, shy, and spoke in clipped, broken English. They were drawn by the impossible, wonderful sound of babies laughing in the valley. Lydia sat them on the porch. She had no slate. She used the smooth, sanded lid of an old crate. She had no chalk. She used a stick of charcoal from the fire. A, she said, her voice soft but clear, drawing the letter. A is for Aspen. B, she drew. B is for Blue Wind Creek. C, she said, is for cabin. They watched her, their dark eyes wide, and haltingly began to copy her marks. She was not just teaching them their letters. She was giving them their world, one piece at a time. The community, which had been so quick to condemn, began, slowly, to rebuild its bonds. Maribel arrived one afternoon, not with rumors, but with 2 bolts of soft, unbleached flannel. "Can't have the judge's wards wrapped in old shirts?" she said gruffly, dropping the cloth on the table. Rowan, who had been skinning out a fine line of marten, looked up. He didn't offer thanks. He offered a trade. He gestured to the stack of deep, rich, perfectly cured pelts. "Take your pick. They'll fetch a good price in Gallatin." Mara's eyes lit up. This was not charity. This was business. This was respect. She selected 6 of the best pelts. "This'll do." As she bundled them, she looked around the cabin at the pot bubbling on the porch, at the slate leaning against the wall, at the 2 small, intricately carved name boards, Mabel and Junia, now hanging over the cot. "It's different," she said, nodding. "It feels lived in." The center of that life was the sound. Mabel and Junia, who had arrived as near-frozen bundles, were now healthy, fat-cheeked, and loud. They had discovered their voices, their gurgles, their small, happy shrieks, and their sudden, delighted laughter became the new soundtrack of Cedar Hollow. It was the music that played under the rhythmic thud of Rowan's axe, the scrape of Lydia's charcoal, and the sizzle of the porch pot. It was the sound of hard work having a purpose. The porch itself needed mending. The bullet scar from Lydia's warning shot was a raw, ugly reminder. One bright, warm afternoon, Rowan decided it was time. He brought out his tools and a long, clean-grained pine plank he'd been seasoning for years. Lydia sat on the porch steps, bouncing Junia on her knee, watching him. He stripped off his heavy coat, then his wool overshirt, leaving him in his thin flannel work shirt. He rolled the sleeves up, past the elbow. Lydia's breath caught. She had seen his strength in violence and in rescue, but this was different. This was strength at rest, at work. The muscles in his forearms coiled and relaxed as he worked the hand plane, sending thin, fragrant curls of pine shaving to the floor. His biceps, broad and defined, moved under the worn cloth as he set the new rail, his focus absolute. She found herself staring, her gaze lingering a beat too long. She was watching the way the sun caught the light brown hair on his arms, the way a single bead of sweat tracked from his temple down his jaw. It was an appreciation so deep and sudden it made her flush. He finished. The new rail was solid, clean, and perfectly fitted. He stepped back, wiping his brow with his sleeve. But he wasn't done. He took his small, bone-handled knife, the one he'd given her in the cabin, which she had since given back, and knelt by the rail. With a surgeon's steadiness, he began to carve. He didn't carve a pattern or a name. He carved a long, shallow, perfectly smooth groove, a hollow along the entire top edge of the rail, rounding it, softening it. "What are you doing?" she asked. He ran his calloused thumb along the groove, testing its smoothness. He didn't look up. "For small hands," he said, his voice a low rumble, "so they don't get splinters when they learn to walk." Lydia's heart gave a lurch. He wasn't talking about if. He was talking about when. He wasn't just mending a porch. He was building a future. He was planning, in this small, silent way, to be there to see Mabel and Junia pull themselves up. It was a detail so small, and it spoke so largely of the man, that it left her without words. That evening, Lydia made her own mark. She took the bunches of mint and wild musk herbs she had been drying and tied them with twine. She hung them from the lintel of the front door. Instantly, the scent, a sharp, clean, earthy perfume, filled the cabin. It mixed with the pine-shaving smell from the new rail and the ever-present aroma of wood smoke. It was the smell of home. It was her signature on the place. They stood on the porch, looking at the sign Rowan had just finished carving. They had written it together. Lydia had formed the words. He had given them shape in the wood. It was their new creed, their declaration to the valley. "This hearth is open. Who needs warmth will find it. Who needs food will have it. Who seeks trouble, move along." Rowan nailed it to the main post, next to the gash left by the Skull Canyon rider's bullet, the new wood and the old scar, side by side. Dusk settled, the sky turning a deep, bruised purple. The first coyotes began their lonely, yipping chorus from the far ridge. The air grew a sudden, sharp chill. Lydia, tired from the day, leaned her shoulder against the post, pulling her thin shawl tighter. Rowan was sitting on the steps, cleaning his knife. The day's work done, he saw her shiver. He stood. He was a large man, and he moved with a silence that always surprised her. He walked over, his shadow falling over her. She looked up. He didn't speak. He shrugged out of his heavy sheepskin coat, the one he had wrapped the babies in during the storm. It was warm from his body heat. He held it open and draped it around her shoulders. It was an act of immense, careful intimacy. His hands, which had held her elbow as she ate, which had planed the new rail, came within an inch of her shoulders. They hovered there, the leathery, calloused fingers just grazing the air above her. He did not touch her skin. He let the coat settle, a heavy, warm weight, and then his hands retreated. The coat enveloped her. It smelled of him of wool, clean sweat, pine, and smoke. It was a shield, a gift, an embrace without touch. She clutched the fleece-lined collar under her chin, her gaze meeting his in the fading light. He simply nodded, once, and went back to his seat on the steps. Lydia stood there, wrapped in his warmth, listening to the coyotes. She had been saved by his strength. She had been protected by his righteousness. Now, she was being cared for by his gentleness, the sharp, clear line of gratitude. The debt she owed him was blurring. It was fading. like the last light on the peaks, dissolving into something softer, warmer, and infinitely more complicated. It was like the mountain mist, and she could no longer tell where the thank you ended and the I began. The rain came in the late afternoon, not with the violence of the blizzard, but with a soft, steady hush. It was a spring rain, a cleansing rain, and it smelled of damp earth and the new, tender leaves of the aspen. The sharp, clean scent of the mint Lydia had hung over the door frame was released into the air, mixing with the wood smoke from the porch pot, which sizzled quietly under the eaves. Inside the cabin, Mabel and Junia were asleep, their breaths too small, identical rhythms in the warm, secure dark. Lydia stood on the porch, her arms resting on the new railing. She ran her palms back and forth over the pine, feeling the perfect, smooth-planed surface Rowan had crafted. She loved this new rail. It was solid. It was the first beautiful, finished thing she had touched in memory. She leaned her weight against it, watching the drops dimple the mud in the clearing. A sudden, contrary gust of wind, colder than the rest, swept down from the Ironvale Pass. It whipped a few stray strands of her hair across her face and sent a sharp, involuntary shiver through her thin wool dress. She didn't retreat. She was no longer a person who retreated from the wind. Instead, she leaned forward, and as the shiver passed, she pressed her lips to the smooth, clean edge of the wood, biting down, just slightly. It was a grounding, sensory gesture, the taste of pine and safety. She didn't hear him. He had been in the small barn, mending a piece of harness, but he had seen her shiver. He moved with a mountain lion's silence, his moccasined feet making no sound on the packed earth. He stepped onto the porch. The floorboards were slick with mist. He came to stand directly behind her. She was still looking out at the rain, and she only realized he was there when his warmth, the solid, radiating heat of him, blocked the chill from her back. And then he touched her. His hands, large and calloused, settled on her waist. They were not tentative, they were not light, they were firm, possessive, and utterly steady. He didn't say, "You'll slip." He didn't say, "You're cold." His touch was the only explanation. He was steadying her on the wet deck, and in doing so, he was anchoring her to the world. Lydia froze, her breath hitched in her throat, sharp and silent. The cold from the rain was instantly forgotten, burned away by the 2 points of contact on her hips. The heat from his palms was astonishing. It penetrated the thin wool of her dress as if it were muslin, a direct, living current that spread from her waist, up her ribs, and into her chest. A spark, a slow, unfolding jolt that made her heart stumble, then beat, harder, against her ribs. They didn't move. They didn't speak. For a long, stretched-out moment, the only sounds in the world were the whisper of the rain on the sod roof and the soft bubble of the pot over the fire. He didn't move his hands. She didn't pull away. He just held her, his grip solid, respectful, and absolute. He was so close she could feel the slow, steady rise and fall of his chest against her shoulders. Though he wasn't pressing against her, their breathing, which had been separate, began to fall into the same rhythm, slowly. Lydia turned her head. She had to look up to find his face. He was looking down at her, his expression unreadable in the gray afternoon light, his eyes dark and fixed on hers. She tilted her head back, a small, trusting gesture. The motion was so slight, but it brought the fine, loose hair at her temple brushing against the rougher texture of his beard, just at the line of his jaw. He didn't flinch. The scent of the mint she had hung in the doorway, which had clung to her hair, rose between them. Her voice was barely a breath, lost in the sound of the rain. "I've stopped being afraid of the wind." His eyes softened. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth, a gesture of such rare, unguarded warmth it made her heart ache. "I'm still afraid," he rumbled, his voice so low she felt it in her bones more than she heard it. She looked at him, confused. Him afraid. Afraid, he finished, his gaze holding hers. Of letting go of what I'm holding. It was a confession, a raw, simple, frontier truth. He wasn't steadying her. He was holding her. He was admitting he didn't want to stop. The spark became a slow, deep, liquid warmth. Lydia's right hand, which had been resting on the rail, lifted. She moved it with a slow, deliberate grace, and she placed it, firmly, on top of his left hand at her waist. His hand was so large, her own looked small against it, but her message was clear. She covered his hand, her fingers pressing into his calloused knuckles. And then she squeezed, just once, a light, answering pressure. A world of consent, of acceptance, of mutual feeling passed in that single silent gesture. His hand, beneath hers, turned slightly, his thumb brushing the side of her palm. The rain, which had been a whisper, quickened into a steady, soft drumming. The mist began to blow under the eaves, wetting their shoulders. "You'll get soaked," he said, his voice still a low vibration. He didn't release her. He guided her, his hands on her waist, and they both took a step back, moving deeper into the shelter of the porch, until they were standing against the solid, warm log wall of the cabin, next to the door. They were face to face now. The air was colder, but here, under the roof, they were in their own space. He was wearing his light leather work gloves. Slowly, deliberately, he kept his eyes on hers as he pulled the first glove off, finger by finger. Using his teeth to grip the cuff, he tucked it into his belt. He did the same with the other. His bare hands, scarred and clean, returned to her, but not to her waist. He lifted his right hand. He was so careful, as if she were a wild, skittish thing that might bolt. He cupped her jaw, his palm rough and warm against her skin. She leaned into the touch, a small, unconscious movement, closing her eyes for just a second. With his thumb, he gently brushed a single, damp strand of hair that the wind had plastered to her cheek. He traced the line of her cheekbone, his touch a question. Lydia opened her eyes. She looked up at him, her gaze clear, steady, and unafraid. She was not the terrified woman from the snowbank. She was not the grieving victim in the courtroom. She was the woman who taught letters with charcoal, who had fired a warning shot, who was wearing his coat. She met his look, and in her eyes, he saw his answer. He leaned in. The kiss was achingly slow. It was not the sudden, desperate, consuming kiss of a storybook. It was a frontier kiss, practical, earned, and built on a foundation of shared survival. It was soft. It was cautious. It was, at first, just the simple, warm pressure of his lips against hers. It was a question, she answered by rising on her toes. Just slightly, her free hand coming up to rest on his chest, her fingers curling into the rough flannel of his shirt. Her back was pressed against the solid, unyielding strength of the main porch post, the very pillar of the home he had built. He did not crowd her. He did not press his body against hers. He kept a small, respectful distance, his weight resting on his hands as he braced himself against the log wall on either side of her, bracketing her, sheltering her. His hands were on her face, his thumbs stroking her jawline. The kiss deepened. It was a long, slow discovery, a mapping of new territory. It was the taste of coffee and wood smoke and the clean, metallic tang of the rain. It was the relief of a tension that had been building for weeks, a tension that had lived underneath the fear, the gratitude, and the quiet domesticity. It was the first truly gentle thing that had happened to her in a lifetime. It lasted as long as the rain, a slow, steady, quiet exploration that had nowhere to be, no one to impress. When they finally broke apart, they didn't move far. He rested his forehead against hers. His eyes were closed. She was smiling, a real, unguarded smile, her breath coming in soft, Warm clouds in the cool air. The rain drummed on the roof. A soft applause. "Don't apologize," she whispered, her voice husky. She knew his code. She knew he might see this as a breach of his solitary, respectful duty. His eyes opened, dark and very close. "I wasn't planning to." He kissed her one more time, a short, firm, punctuating kiss that was not a question, but a statement, a promise. He stepped back, giving her air, though his hand found hers and held it. Lydia's gaze drifted to the small table by the door, where he often sat to whittle in the evenings. Lying there was a small, simple loop of string. It was strung with little wooden beads, no bigger than peas, that he had carved from the same scrap of pine as the new railing. They were sanded perfectly smooth. She let go of his hand, stepped to the table, and picked up the string of beads. He had made it, she knew, in the quiet hours, just as he had carved the names, Mabel and Junea. She looked at him, then, without a word, she slid the simple, humble ornament onto her own wrist. It wasn't a diamond. It was just wood and twine, a tiny, worthless, priceless thing. It was a small sign for a promise so large it didn't have words yet. The rain stopped, as if a curtain had been drawn. The drumming on the roof ceased, replaced by the sound of dripping from the eaves. The porch was dark, wet, and smelled of mint. Lydia stood there, the string of beads on her wrist, wrapped in his coat. Rowan stood by the post, watching her. The air between them was charged, a quiet, powerful energy that had found its path. The passion was there, a steady, warm ember in their chests, but it hadn't burned away the safety. It had been forged from it. It didn't start with a gunshot. It started with the noise of a town on the move. The late morning sun had melted the last of the frost, and the air held a fragile warmth. Lydia was on the porch, rocking Mabel, the sound of Rowan's axe splitting wood nearby a steady, comforting rhythm. The porch pot bubbled, sending a plume of steam smelling of herbs and venison into the air. Then the sound came, a low, confused rumble, the sound of dozens of hooves, of wagon wheels, of men talking, not in conversation, but in anticipation. Rowan emerged from the tree line, his axe in hand, his face a mask. He looked down the valley. "Lydia, go inside. Take the children. Bar the window." "What is it?" "It's Barnaby," he said, "and he's brought an audience." She swept Juna from the cot, her heart a cold stone in her chest, and retreated into the cabin's shadows. She barred the heavy wooden shutter, plunging the room into dim light. She found the rifle, Rowan's sharps, and loaded it, just as he had taught her. She would not be helpless. Rowan did not retreat. He laid his axe by the door. A tool, not a weapon. He stood on his porch, his hands empty, and waited. They came into view. It was a procession. Barnaby Cross was at the front, on a new high-stepping black horse. He was flanked by 6 men. These were not the disorganized Skull Canyon riders. These were hard, quiet men, wearing new cartridge belts, their rifles resting comfortably in their saddle scabbards. They looked like they were owed money and enjoyed collecting it. And behind them, the crowd. A straggling tail of nearly 20 people from Copper Spur. Men from the saloon, women from the dry goods store, even a few of the older shepherd children Lydia had been teaching. They had come to watch. They had come for the spectacle, their faces a mixture of fear, curiosity, and a dark, hungry excitement. They were turning his home, his sanctuary, into a stage. They were turning this porch into a potential scaffold. Barnaby pulled up 20 yards from the steps. The crowd fanned out behind him, forming a silent, watchful semicircle. "Rowan Hargrove." Barnaby's voice was high and triumphant. He was playing to his audience. He pulled a thick, folded document from his coat. "It's over. I've been to Gallatin. I have a new writ." He held it high. It was an official-looking paper, sealed with a large, gaudy splotch of red wax. The ink on it smudged, as if it had been pressed in a great and angry hurry. "A full judicial order," Barnaby shouted, his eyes gleaming. "Signed and sealed by the district. It voids Blackwood's little order. It grants me full and immediate custody of my children, and it authorizes these men," he gestured to his 6 silent riders, "to use any force necessary to retrieve my property." Rowan stood unmoving. "Your paper's a lie. Cross." "It's the law!" Barnaby shrieked, his composure cracking. "And you, sir, are in contempt, men. Go and get my children. And the woman." The 6 riders began to dismount, their movements slow, deliberate. The crowd surged forward, craning their necks. "Hold." The voice was a dry, breathless rasp. A single horse, ridden to a lather, broke through the line of spectators. Deputy Calder Pike slid from the saddle, his chest heaving. He staggered, his hand on his gun belt, and looked at the scene with pure, unadulterated exhaustion. "Pike," Barnaby sneered. "You're too late. I have the authority. This is out of your hands." "That paper," Pike panted, pointing a shaking finger at the document in Barnaby's hand. "Ain't worth the wax it's stamped with." Barnaby's face went white. "What?" "I've been in Gallatin myself. I've been at the telegraph office for 2 days, talking to Judge Blackwood's clerk." Pike reached into his own coat, his movements slow, his eyes on the 6 hired guns. He pulled out a flimsy, yellow piece of paper, a telegraph. "This," Pike said, his voice carrying in the sudden, dead silence, "is real. Came in this morning, from the judge himself." He read it aloud. "To Deputy Calder Pike, stop. Barnaby Cross's petition for a new hearing denied. Stop. His fraudulent document void. Stop. The temporary order of protection for Lydia Merritt and children is hereby extended indefinitely until a full circuit trial can be convened. Stop. Any attempt to circumvent this order is a felony. Stop." Pike folded the telegraph. "You're done, Barnaby." The silence was absolute. The crowd, which had been on Barnaby's side, was now just a collection of confused, staring faces. Barnaby had been exposed, humiliated. He had brought the whole town to watch him be undone by a piece of yellow paper. A man in the back of the crowd snickered. It was that sound, that small, sharp sound of ridicule, that broke him. Barnaby's face, which had been pale with shock, went to a deep, mottled purple. His eyes, small and wild, darted from Pike to the crowd, to Rowan. "No," he whispered. "No." His hand, the one holding the false writ, dropped it. The paper fluttered to the ground. His other hand went to his hip. He drew his revolver. It all happened in a single, terrible heartbeat. Rowan didn't reach for his axe. He didn't dive for cover. He moved to Lydia. The cabin door was just behind him. He took one step back, putting himself directly in the line of fire. He didn't raise his hands to fight. He raised them open, to the side, his body a living shield to protect the door, to protect the woman and children he could not see but knew were cowering just beyond the wood. "Barnaby, drop it," Pike roared, fumbling for his own weapon. "Drop it now, that's an order." The 6 hired guns froze. Their hands moved toward their own pistols, but they stopped. They looked at Pike, at his uniform, at the telegraph in his hand. This wasn't a simple retrieval anymore. This was a direct conflict with the county law, in front of 20 witnesses. Their pay didn't cover this. 2 of them took a subtle step back. Barnaby screamed. It was a high, thin sound of pure, animal rage. He fired. But not at Rowan. He fired straight up into the air. The shot was a deafening crack that echoed, flat and hard. Off the mountains. The crowd panicked. Women screamed. Men ducked and scrambled, pushing each other to get to their horses, to get behind the wagons. The perfect captive audience dissolved into a stampede of terror. In that instant of chaos, Barnaby's shaking hand lowered the barrel, aiming it squarely at the center of Rowan's chest, at the door, at the family behind him. Rowan moved. He didn't tackle him. He didn't rush him. He lunged sideways, to his left, a violent diagonal movement that took him from the center of the porch to the far post. It was a strategist's move. It wasn't an attack. It was a distraction. It was designed to pull the eye, to spoil the aim of a man blinded by rage. It worked. Barnaby's unsteady hand jerked, instinctively following the sudden, large movement. He fired again. The bullet went wild. It missed Rowan by a yard. It tore into the high porch rafter, the one just above the new, smooth handrail. The sound was a sharp thwack, followed by a zing as the bullet ricocheted into the sky. A second scar, high above the first, showered the porch in a rain of fresh, pale wood splinters and sawdust. Before Barnaby could fire a third time, Pike was on him. The deputy didn't draw his gun. He used his entire body, slamming into Barnaby's side, and the two of them went down in a clumsy, rolling heap. Pike's fist rose and fell. Once, Barnaby went limp. The chaos settled as quickly as it had begun. The hired guns had not moved. The crowd, seeing the danger was over, crept back, their faces pale. Pike got to his feet, breathing heavily. He had Barnaby's revolver. He stood over the man, who was groaning. The cabin door opened. Lydia stepped out. She was not holding the rifle. She was holding Mabel. Her face was ashen, but her eyes were fire. She didn't look at Pike. She didn't look at Barnaby, who was stirring on the ground. She looked at the crowd, at the women, at the children, at the men who had come to watch her family be torn apart. Her voice was not a whisper. It was not a plea. It was as clear and cold as the water in Blue Wind Creek. "You came here to see a show," she called out, her voice carrying in the stunned silence. "You came to see this aggrieved husband claim his property." She held Mabel tighter. "Do you know why I ran? Do you know what this man did?" She pointed at Barnaby, who was pushing himself to his knees. "He had his men tie my wrists with baling twine, the kind with wire in it, because I wouldn't let him harm them." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. This was not the story Barnaby had told. "He left me in a woodshed in the dark," Lydia continued, her voice rising, cutting through the murmurs. "And do you know why he did it? Do you know what my crime was?" She looked around, her gaze landing on the women in the crowd, the mothers. "My crime was giving him daughters, because he looked at my babies, my beautiful, perfect babies, and he called them burdens." That word, burdens, it landed harder than a bullet. The murmuring wasn't curiosity now. It was anger. A woman at the front, who ran the bakery in Copper Spur. Her face hardened. "What did you say?" "Burdens," Lydia repeated, her voice thick with the memory. "He said they were useless, and that he would throw all three of them into the snow before he'd raise them. That is why I ran. That is the man who claims the law is on his side." The crowd turned. The women, especially, their faces, which had been curious, were now masks of contempt. The baker pointed a flour-dusted finger at Barnaby. "Shame on you, Barnaby Cross," she said, her voice shaking with rage. "Shame!" Pike saw his moment. The crowd was his. The law was clear. He hauled Barnaby to his feet. Barnaby's lip was split and bleeding. "Deputy, you can't," Barnaby sputtered, seeing the faces, seeing he had lost everything. Pike shoved him forward, pulling handcuffs from his belt. "Barnaby Cross," he said, his voice loud for the crowd. "You are under arrest. Forgery of a judicial document. Discharging a firearm in a threatening manner. Assault on a county officer. And violation of a district court protection order." The sound of the cuffs ratcheting shut was the loudest thing in the valley. The 6 hired guns, seeing their employer in irons, quietly, as one, mounted their horses. One of them tipped his hat to Pike. "Our business is concluded, Deputy." They turned and rode away, their job unpaid, but their lives intact. Pike shoved Barnaby toward his horse. You're coming to Gallatin, and you're going to explain this all to Judge Blackwood, personally." As he was being forced onto his horse, Barnaby twisted. He spat a wad of blood onto the porch, just missing Rowan's boot. This isn't over, Hargrove," he seethed, his voice a wet, furious whisper. "You'll pay for this, you and that witch." Lydia didn't answer. She didn't flinch. She adjusted the blanket around Mabel, who had slept through the entire thing. She turned her back on Barnaby Cross. She walked past Rowan, who was inspecting the new raw scar on the rafter. She went through the open cabin door, where the smell of mint and wood smoke was suddenly, overwhelmingly, the smell of peace. She looked at the cot, where Junia was just beginning to stir, her tiny fists waving in the air, safe from the noise. The victory wasn't the handcuffs. It wasn't the cheers of the crowd, which were now tentatively rising. It was the quiet. She had won. Righteousness had won. The afternoon light, which had been a harsh, white glare during the confrontation, softened. It slanted low from the west, turning thick and golden, pouring over the Cedar Hollow Valley like warm honey. The air, which had been sharp with the smell of black powder and fear, now settled, carrying only the scent of pine and the rich, herbal steam from the bubbling porch pot. The crowd, which had come for a spectacle, had seen the truth. They dispersed not with jeers, but in small, quiet, thoughtful groups, their faces sobered. They had seen Barnaby's mask ripped away, and they had seen Lydia's courage. They nodded at her as they left, looks of newfound, profound respect. Deputy Calder Pike was the last to leave. He cinched his saddle, his movements still weary, but his shoulders were straighter. He looked at Lydia, who stood on the porch, rocking Junia. "He won't be back, ma'am," Pike said, his voice a gravelly reassurance. "Between the forgery and the assault, Judge Blackwood will have him in the Gallatin jail for a very long time. This is over." He tipped his hat, a gesture that included both Lydia and Rowan. He mounted his horse and, without looking back, rode down the path, the sound of his hooves fading until there was only silence and peace. The silence was vast. It was the silence of the high mountains, but it was no longer the empty, lonely silence of Rowan's past. It was a shared quiet, filled with the small, domestic sounds from the cabin, the soft thump of Lydia rocking the cradleboard with her foot, the crackle of the porch pot, the distant cry of a hawk riding the high thermals. Rowan stood on the porch, his eyes fixed on the new scar in the high rafter, the pale, splintered gash left by Barnaby's last, desperate bullet. It was an insult, a violation of his home, of their sanctuary, the final, ugly mark of a violence that had been defeated. He turned, went to his small woodshed, and returned not with his axe, but with a small, folded square of sandpaper. He climbed onto the porch railing, bracing his large frame against the post, and in the golden afternoon light, he began to work. The sound was a soft, rhythmic shushing. Shh, shh. He was sanding the raw wood, smoothing the splintered edges, erasing the wound. His arm, the same one that had locked the Skull Canyon man's shoulder, now moved with a patient, focused grace. He was not just mending the wood. He was erasing the memory. He was reclaiming the space, making it clean. The cabin door opened. Lydia stepped out, leaving the door ajar so she could hear the babies. She held 2 steaming tin mugs. The sharp, clean scent of pine needle tea cut the air. "I made tea," she said, her voice soft, "the way you showed me." He stopped his work, looking down at her. He nodded and carefully stepped down from the railing, landing silently on the porch deck. He was dusted with fine, pale sawdust. She handed him one of the mugs. Their fingers brushed. It was a simple, domestic gesture, one that had become normal in the last few weeks. As he took the mug, Lydia's free hand, as if by its own memory, came to rest on his waist. It was the habit of balance she had learned that first day in the rain. It was her anchor. She looked up at him, her eyes clear, full of a peace he had never seen in them. But as his gaze met hers, a shadow of the old, deep shyness, the sheer, sudden newness of this affection, flickered across her face. Her lips parted, and she caught her lower lip, just barely, in her teeth. It was a gesture of nervousness, of a happiness so profound it was almost frightening. Rowan saw it. He saw the trust, and the tremor beneath it. He set his untouched mug of tea on the railing, next to the smooth, child-safe groove he had carved. He didn't speak. He simply covered her hand, which rested on his hip. With his own, his palm was warm and dry, layered with calluses and the fine powder from the wood. And then his arm slid around her. He pulled her closer, not with force, but with a solid, gravitational pull. It was not the sudden, steadying grip from the rain. It was not the desperate, shielding hold from the confrontation. This was different. It was the firm, unwavering hold of a man who was not just protecting, but choosing, an affirmation that needed no words. He felt her small, answering sigh, and her body, which had been braced, relaxed against his. He held her tighter. "You are here. I am here. This is real." He leaned down, and she rose to meet him. The first kiss had been a question, a discovery in the rain. This was the answer. It was deep. It was slow. It was a long, unfolding warmth that had been building for weeks, forged in the ice of the blizzard, tempered in the fear of the siege, and now released in the gold of the afternoon. It was the kiss of two survivors, of two solitaries who had found their other half. It was a passionate claiming, a sealing of the vow they hadn't yet spoken. But it was utterly, fundamentally safe. There was no desperation in it, only certainty. The world narrowed to the taste of him, the scent of pine and clean sweat and wood smoke, the solid, living strength of his arms. A sudden, happy shriek, followed by a delighted, gurgling laugh, spilled from the open cabin door. Mabel. Lydia laughed against his mouth, a sound of pure, unbridled joy. She pulled back, her forehead resting against the warm, solid wall of his chest. "They're awake," she whispered, her voice husky. Rowan smiled, a true, broad smile that transformed his rough-hewn face. He rested his cheek against the top of her hair. "They've got good timing." They stood like that for a long moment, him holding her, the mugs of tea growing cold, forgotten on the rail. They looked out at the valley, at their new sign. "Who needs warmth will find it." "We should make it real," Lydia whispered, her voice muffled against his flannel shirt. "The sign," he rumbled, his hand stroking her back. "All of it." She leaned back just enough to look up at him, her face earnest, glowing with a new, quiet purpose. "The porch pot, the letters I teach the shepherd children, this safety, let's make it a place. Rowan, a real place. Not just a cabin. We can call it Hearth on the Bend." He tasted the words, Hearth on the Bend. It felt solid, right. "A place for anyone who needs it," he agreed, picking up her thread. "Hot soup, a warm blanket for the night." "And the letters," she added, her eyes shining. "For any child who wants to learn them. A place to start over. A place to be safe." It was their shared vow, whispered on a porch scarred by bullets, under a rafter he had just reclaimed. Rowan's gaze drifted to Lydia's wrist, to the simple loop of string and the small, smooth wooden beads he had carved for her. He reached out, his large, rough thumb gently touching them. "They're plain," he said. "They're perfect," she whispered. "Not yet." His voice was low. He took her wrist, his touch exquisitely gentle. He pulled the small, bone-handled knife from the sheath on his belt, the same knife that had cut her free from the frozen twine, the same knife that had carved Mabel's and Junia's names. She watched, her breath held, as he braced her hand in his, with the precision of a master craftsman. His large, steady hand moved the blade tip. There, in the golden light, on the largest bead, the one at the very center, he carved 2 tiny, perfect, interlocked letters, L, M. He blew the fine dust of wood away and folded her fingers over it. It was a brand, a mark, a naming. Lydia's eyes shone, a sudden brightness. She blinked, and a single tear of gratitude, of overwhelming peace, traced a path down her cheek. He wiped it away with his thumb. She sniffed, smiling, and reached into the pocket of her apron. She, too, had been working in the quiet hours. She pulled out a small, folded square of white linen. It was finer than his shirts, edged with a simple, delicate lace she had unraveled from one of her own ruined garments. In the corner, in neat, steady, dark blue thread, she had embroidered 2 letters, R-H. It's not as strong as wood," she said, her voice trembling just slightly. "It's just lace and thread." He took it from her. He unfolded the small, soft square in his massive, calloused palm. He stared at the letters. He had never in his life owned anything so fine. He had never owned anything with his own initials on it. It was a piece of civilization, of care, of her. He folded it with a deliberate, almost reverent care, and tucked it into the breast pocket of his flannel shirt, placing it securely over his heart. He looked at her, his dark eyes saying more than his words ever could. "It's stronger than steel," he said. He slipped his arm back around her waist, and she leaned her head on his shoulder. Side by side, they stood on the porch and watched the day end. The sky over the high, dark peaks of the Ironvale Range was pooling with bruises of purple and soft strokes of apricot. The porch pot bubbled its promise. The babies cooed inside. There was no grand promise of riches. There was no guarantee of an easy life. The future was not a distant, shining city. It was just tomorrow. It was the simple, solid promise of splitting wood, and teaching letters, and stirring the pot, and watching the sun set. Together. The air grew cooler. The golden light faded to a deep, velvety blue. Lydia shivered, but not from the cold. She turned in his arms, her body fitting against his, her hands finding their own place on his strong, solid shoulders. She was the one who initiated it. Her hands slid up, her fingers tangling in the rough, thick hair at the nape of his neck. She pulled his head down to hers. Their breath mingled, warm in the cooling air. This was not a question, or an answer. This was a statement. This was the full, active, and complete trust of a woman who had been broken by the world and was now whole. It was the passionate, joyous, and grateful acceptance of a man who had been a ghost and was now, finally, and fully, alive. Their bodies fit together, her hands in his hair, his arm an iron-strong, possessive band around her waist, holding her, grounding her. The porch had seen the blizzard and the terror. It had been scarred by bullets and stained by hate, but the violence had been washed away, the wounds sanded smooth, the space reclaimed. On the porch, where every storm had finally passed, they chose love as their roof, and the story closed. Not on a final word, but on the deep, abiding, and hard-won promise of that kiss in the dusk. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We would be honored to know where you're listening from tonight. Please share your thoughts and your city or state in the comments below, so we can all connect and share this experience. Please subscribe to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, like this video. And if you enjoyed this journey, please support us by hitting the hype button. It helps this story reach and be heard by so many more people. Thank you.